Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host. Today is Veterans Day, and in honor of the holiday, I've once again invited a panel of Air Force combat camera veterans to share stories from their time in uniform. As longtime listeners know, I'm also a combat camera veteran, and my guests are fellow service members I worked with when I was stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. Jim Stayton, you served 22 years in the Air Force and retired as a master sergeant. Welcome back to Below the Line.
Thanks, Rob.
Glad you're here, Jim. Also returning to the show, Fred Johnson. You served 7.5 years, separated from the Air Force as a senior airman, and now you're a photographer, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, and the founder of thisweekinphoto.com. Welcome back.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here. I mean, LT, sorry.
Finally, joining us for the first time, J.R. Cole. You served 28 years in the Air Force and retired as the chief of the 1st Combat Camera Squadron. Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be here with you guys, some of the greatest guys I've ever been with.
JR, we'll see if the stories you tell today back that up. For myself, I served 5 years in the Air Force, 3 years at Vandenberg and 2 years in DC, and separated as a captain. As they've already indicated, my guests today do not know me as Skid and are likely to call me LT or Rob during our conversation. Are there any other nicknames I need to mention up front, guys, that you guys are going to wheel out here?
None that I could say on this recording.
PG.
You were the boss of us, remember? So
yeah, and now I'm not. This is the consequences. One last note before we get started. Today would have been my dad's 79th birthday, if not for COVID, which took him from us last year just before Christmas. My dad loved the movies and was very supportive of my work in the industry. He was also a 30-year Army veteran, and he both inspired my own military service and informs my engagement with military issues to this day. Okay, we're going to dive right into this. For listeners who would like to first learn more about the history of combat camera, I recommend you visit usafcombatcamera.org/history. They've got a lot of stories there, and it's going to be very informative. We're not going to spend a lot of time with that. Also, if you haven't listened already, you might also enjoy last year's podcast, which was season 6, episode 10. That episode, we focused on our time together at Vandenberg Air Force Base. We're going to pick up with some of that today and see where it goes. So, gentlemen, let's talk about what combat camera was like when you guys joined in.
I'm probably the oldest head.
Yes.
I joined the Air Force in 1973, right at the end of the Vietnam War. And there had been a lot of focus on combat camera at that time. So there were a lot of people in the audiovisual services throughout the Air Force, and they were busy kind of trying to pare it down. And the speed graphics 4x5 camera was still in use, although it did have electronic flashes rather than bulbs. Color was new to the military, getting it done in-house rather than farming it out to Kodak. And that's about it. I got to watch the technology move all the way before my retirement to sending imagery through satellites. From having couriers that traveled the world, we were now transmitting by satellites when I retired.
Hey, I came in a little bit later than he did. I came in the Air Force in 83, but I didn't get into the combat camera until 91. When I came in 91 was just after the Gulf War, and digital technology was taken off on the still side. Video was still very much 3/4 inch to 1 inch, and we were carrying multiple recorder plus a cable between us to the handheld camera portion of it. We used to tease the photographers because they had to run all over the place trying to find, a place to do their film because they wanted to go digital, but it wasn't quality enough. The first cameras we used in the Desert Storm was digital that they tried to use became doorstops because they just really weren't capable of getting the quality that, they want on digital media.
So, JR, what did you do when you came into the Air Force? Why came into the camera stuff later?
I came in as a cable dog. And to give you a perspective of that, when I first came in, I told them I wanted electronics. And they said, okay, well, you can do electronics. You scored high enough. And I said, good. So I got electronics. They told me, he says, you're going to be a cable splicer. I said, what is that? They said, well, basically a cable splicer is you're going to wire airplanes. And I'm like, cool. So that sounds interesting. I'll do that. Then when I got to basic training, they made me climb a 90-foot pole and jump around with a harness on. Didn't understand what that had to do with an airplane. But then they told me, no, you're more like Power Pro. You're going to be climbing up, hooking up electricity. It's not what I wanted. I want to be on an airplane, but I'll go with that. And then when I got into after basic training, got to my tech school at Shepherd Air Force Base, I was actually a telephone guy. They slapped it down in front of me and said, these are the wires that connect communication. So my career, for the most part, until the last probably 4 years, was all under communication. Even when we were Avis, I just barely nipped Avis as I went into communications again under the comm squadron. And this is a really funny story because photography was not my repertoire or anything I ever thought of. But when I went to go cross-train because I had a bad knee, they told me we're going to give you a chance to reclassify because of your medical issue. I said, all right, I can't climb telephone poles anymore. What do you got? They said, you got your top 3 choices. So as I was going through a book, because it was not computers at that time, it was a book. So I'm reading different things that it matched the area that I could cross-train in. And I decided that I would try for it because I was an instructor in communications, fiber optics at Shepherd Air Force Base for 6 years. I wanted to be an instructor. So I tried to do the altitude chamber. They said, no, I couldn't do that because I had allergies. They told me I could do the rest of everything I picked. To be a long story short, aircraft sheet metal was my 3rd choice. So basically, when the pages stuck together, when I flipped it over, it was combat camera was the number I wrote down. Had no clue. So when I'm waiting to find out what my job was, they came back and told me, says, you got your 3rd choice. I'm like, great, I'll be an aircraft sheet metal. They said, no, you're going to be combat camera because it had a bonus. And your last job had a bonus. And they kind of matched that up. I said, what is a combat camera? They said, well, it's you take pictures, you'll be happy. Little they say with my great knee that I was running with a 50-pound camera through fields and stuff and doing all the stuff that we had to do. I'm not sure it was the best medical decision for me, but it ended up being the best decision I backed up into.
Now, for all you guys in starting out, do they decide early who's going to be a still photographer, which is what Jim, Fred, you guys did, and who's going to be a videographer, JR, which is what you were doing, at least when we were working together?
Actually, my initial job was continuous film processing for reconnaissance. That was my school, and they were combining the career fields of processing and photography and spinning off reconnaissance processing into another section. And I was the only one out of a class of 11 that got sent to a base photo lab. Everybody else got sent to fighter jets with the reconnaissance capabilities, and I got sent to a photo lab at Vandenberg.
You applied for the job, and processing and still photography end up merging later. And it has grown even since then. I mean, Fred even tapped into the electronic imaging and the EIC and all that, which was just the start of combining everything. Today, it's all one career field. There's no longer videographers, still photographers. It's all one career field. You have to learn it underneath the PA umbrella. You have to learn how to do all of it.
And that's a big change from when we were in as well. While we were there, I know audiovisual, as you alluded to earlier, JR, got merged under communications. But we were still operational and worked on the operational side of the house. But now apparently, and again, I'm not following it too closely, but all of it went under public affairs.
Combat camera is still operation. It's still the combat camera mission here at Charleston Air Force Base, and our subunits are the UTCs out at Hill and Lackland. Vandenberg is no longer within that realm. But basically, they still do the operation job, but it's underneath the PA umbrella. So instead of going to comm operational sections through AMC, we go back to the Air Force level, which can be a problem because when you had a problem with an airman that messed up and you go to have a court martial, we found out very shortly that there's only 2 spots and we were at the air staff, and the chief of staff had to be the one to make the decision over, and he just wasn't going to do that, being at that level. So you're like going, okay, we have to tie it to the base. So at least for disciplinary actions versus, it was a lot of learning processes when we went underneath public affairs at the air staff level.
I'm kind of curious with Fred, how did he get into photography? First, he was the only guy that was working for me in photojournalism that didn't have his college certificate.
Yeah.
All my photographers had been to Syracuse.
Yeah.
Except for Fred.
Yeah. And I was the best.
He was just this guy over in the corner who played in Photoshop and occasionally went out and took pictures.
Yeah, it was kind of like that. Yeah, the way, just to continue that thread of origin stories into the audiovisual stuff. When I signed up for the military, I had no idea what I was going to be. I went through Lackland. You know how you get to that point where they're like, "Hey, you're going to Thule, Greenland, and you're going to so and so, whatever." You know, we're at that point, and my orders came into Minot, North Dakota. So that was going to be my first base. And I'm from Chicago, you know, South Side kid from Chicago. I was like, I don't care. It's new. Everything's going to be an adventure to me. That sounds great, right? 2 years, whatever, right? So the people that knew what Minot was, you know, it was frigid and cold and desolate up there, were like, "Oh, you're going to Minot? Sorry to hear that, man, blah, 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 blah." I'm like, whatever. And then 2 days later, I got diverted. And they're like, "Oh, your orders got diverted. You're going someplace else now." I'm like, "Where am I going?" Yokota Air Base, Japan. So I go from, you know, the moon basically to, you know, a metropolitan city. And then I got there, you know, I went straight, like you said, Jim, I went straight from basic. This is very little or no college, right? So I went straight from basic training essentially to, after a 2-week, you know, goodbye everybody, get your affairs in order, stay at home, to Yokota. I didn't go to, what do they call it back then?
Tech school.
Go to tech school. Thank you. There was no tech school because I guess it was full or for whatever reasons, needs of the military. I didn't go to tech school. I got CDCs. So I get there and I get this, remember pre-internet, right? So I get this stack of loose leaf books, 5 of them, you know, that I was supposed to go through. I went through the first ones and then they were like, I forget who it was, but they're like, "Go get through this first one, then we'll get you your equipment." And the first one was all about theory and light and shadow and all this other stuff. So I was digging it. I loved it. I was like, "Holy, this is awesome. This is where I'm supposed to be. This is perfect." So I get through that and they're like, "Okay, now we're going to give you your gear. Here's the equipment locker." About a month later. So open this amazing gear locker with every lens known to man and all these Nikon FM2s and F3s and all this stuff in there. Pick 2 camera bodies and lenses and build your bag. And from there, I was hooked. We're in 2021 now. That was just to timestamp the era. I went in 1989. That was 1989 that happened. And we're in 2021, and I'm still as in love with photography as I was going through those CDC books. So it's crazy.
That is crazy. The way it changed during that time period was ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's like you could not have been behind, even though the fact that you didn't have all the schools or even Syracuse or any of those things, it was so forefront that you were growing with it, because film photography obviously is different than digital photography. And I knew that from video. Video was totally different, the way you looked at an image versus a film image. We used to joke with the photographers. I can look back at my video right when I did it going, "This is what I did today. What? Oh, wait a minute. You got film. Yeah, you want me to pull it out? No, you can't. All right, yeah." And they wouldn't get it till later. Then obviously when they went digital, they killed us for a long time because they could get front page news. It was so much smaller than video. It took us a while to catch up. Actually, it took us to the second Gulf War to even get to that point.
Yeah, just to look at the changes over the years, it's crazy. I know I'm going to put rings on my tree saying this, but you look at the state-of-the-art cameras that we had back then. Even at Vandenberg, I think we were shooting with the DCS 420s Kodak. There was like a Kodak Nikon Frankenstein hybrid camera that you remember we had to figure out, because they kept dying. We had to figure out how to make it last for more than a couple hours. So we raided some video battery belts from the video guys and hooked them up.
We might not have even asked.
So we're walking around like Batman with this battery belt with a cable plugged into this Frankenstein unit, creating, what was it, barely 1 megapixel shots. And we were still like, holy crap, this is the future, right? Now we have iPhones that can shoot, edit, transmit, and shoot ridiculous quality video and focus after the fact and all that crazy stuff.
Oh, the iPhone's ridiculous now.
There's something I miss about putting Kodachrome into the Nikon and going out and evaluating a scene and deciding the exposure, not based on what the camera's telling me to take, but based on my experience of shooting it for so many years and saying, this is how I'm going to get this image. Where the camera, the only involvement is I'm telling it what to do and I'm pushing the button. Now, there's some wonderful photography that's being made. I mean, you see it all over the internet, but I would say most people don't know how they got the photo.
That's interesting, though. We talk about this on my little podcast all the time, is does that matter? The folks like us that understand the exposure triangle, f-stop, shutter speed, ISO, and composition and lighting and all, we understand that stuff. And we had to kind of walk over the hot coals of shooting film and having it come out black, kind of understanding that flow. And now we got it. Okay, I can consider myself competent at this art form of photography. And now maybe I can proceed to storytelling because I got the fundamentals down. Now I got to figure out if I have a story to tell and what my genre is and all that stuff. But today you fast forward all of that with a purchase. You can buy all that AI and smarts in a camera. So the question is, does it matter that you have the mechanics and you understand the speed of light and what a silver halide is and all that, if the end result is all you want to do is tell this compelling story about this thing that's important to you, and the device represents the path of least resistance to that? I don't know. I mean, it's like, in my day, we used to take a horse to go and milk cows, and now you could just go to the store and buy milk. Is it better?
I don't disagree, but you still... Like if you bring lights into the situation, you still have to know how to handle your lights. You still have to understand lighting ratios and things. The camera's not doing that for probably another 3-4 years.
True. But I will tell you that I still do training videos and stuff at Boeing. And I had a PJ. This is Russ Cooley. And Russ works for me, and he is Syracuse graduated and has covers of several magazines, during his time in. And I said, look, we're going to start doing training videos and we're going to use photos as well. I want you to buy us gear. I didn't really tell him what to do. He got me a nice bag. It was like, a good bag for my camera, and I was waiting for it to come in. And when I picked it up, my camera was about this big.
This big being about 6 inches is what you're indicating,
yes,
as far as the size of the camera.
And I was like, what is that? He goes, that's your video camera. I'm like, what does it do? He goes, it does video. He goes, well, it looked bigger in the magazine. And he gave me a flash card to put in it. And let me tell you, it's a Canon, and that camera really knocks it out of the park. It does what my $50,000 Betacam didn't do in the old days. The biggest thing from training to what they're doing today is telling the story. Once you get the competence with your camera gear to tell a story, then you've stepped into a different level of photography.
Yeah, and that's the scary part, I think. And I'm still learning this, and it's taken me years to kind of internalize the separation of church and state, right? Where church is the technical and being competent, like Jim says, understanding lighting and how to make sure that, what makes a pleasing photograph, whether it's whatever genre you're dealing in. So all that technical stuff and being proficient at that. And then the state side of that is the story and being able to tell a story, a compelling story, because no one cares. Unless it's another photographer, no one cares how you did it. It's the story, right? At the end of the day. So I think a lot of photographers that I talk to, especially beginning photographers, get stuck in this eddy of gear, right? It's like, okay, my camera does this, I can do this, or I need this one because it can do that, blah, 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 and that becomes the hobby. It's not about the photography. It's literally about, I want to buy the next camera. What are you shooting with? Oh, it's the Fuji this, or it's the Canon that, or it's the Panasonic, whatever. And the work doesn't support the amount of gear or the stories that they're supposed to be telling with this mountain of gear that we can all appreciate. We never had access to, and they have it in a closet. They can't tell stories with this stuff because they're stuck in that eddy of stuff and gear and technique and watching YouTube videos about how to do this and that. And they never really get to the point of, this is the story I need to tell. I'm compelled to tell this story about X. Now I need to back solve that and get the gear that lets me tell that story. They're like Batman building the ultimate Batcave without knowing what crimes they're going to fight, right?
Well, as someone who watches Air Force photography, two things that I noticed, JR may know about. One, first, I watched a aerial photographer get in the back of an F-16 with about 10 yards of black material, like cotton sheets, where he covered the entire inside of the cockpit with this black material and taped it down with black gaffer tape so he wouldn't get reflections in the curved canopy. Because when you're shooting out of the jet, because the canopy's curved, everything reflects into that. And I just thought, where along the line did they lose the fact that we used to put a piece of black foam over the front of the camera, put it up next to the glass, and that would suck all the light out of the glass, and there were no reflections. You didn't have to turn it into a big upside down tent.
Yeah.
One other thing too, after 9/11, there was a big toss up. I can't remember if it was Air Force One flew in front of the Statue of Liberty and scared everybody. They took pictures from an F-16.
This is right after President Obama came into office in 2008.
So, Jim, I thought you said 9/11. Wait, I'm confused about what.
No, what it did was people were trying to compare it
to 9/11. They were
to
scared.
9/11 because there's this big airplane down at, I don't know, 800, 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet, whatever it was, this big airplane. And they're saying that nobody notified the citizens. They look up and they see this big 747 coming down the river.
Right.
Here we go again.
With F-16s around it.
Yeah, and it was right in the beginning of the Obama administration when we did that. And it was to reenact the Ken Hackman photo over Mount Rushmore. And that is still probably the official photo.
So the photographer had the rails. It was supposedly an official photo mission, but whoever done it had never done a photo missions before because the rail of the canopy was in the bottom of the picture. He didn't even get the plane to tilt on its side or anything. It was it had the rails in it, and I wonder, it's like the knowledge that we developed through the years in the old manual days went sideways with the automated systems. They lost track of something somewhere.
Well, I can comment on that actually because I was
knew it
during that time, and the photographer you mentioned is one of the top photographers in the Air Force that came out, Andy Dunaway.
Oh, I know Andy.
And when Andy Dunaway did that shot, we went there and they had hounded me when I was over the comm squadron at Andrews about my contacts to combat camera, wanting to redo that shoot. I went from Andrews to Italy, and then I became the chief of combat camera. So I knew the people at the PAG that wanted that shoot. It was requested. We didn't walk out one day and go, oh, let's go shoot Air Force One. And
oh, no, you can't do that. It doesn't work that way.
So we set that shoot up, and I had a photographer in Air Force One. It was a training mission. A training mission, by the way, that had to happen. It was going to happen anyway. All they did was come down from their training mission for the shot with the F-16s. It cost nothing. So if you saw the news outlet, it was a $350,000 shot. Why do we waste money? And I had people tell me stuff that made me lose my mind. Like, if you want a photo shot like that, you need to get in a helicopter and shoot it going by. And I'm screaming in Alabama, by the way, as I'm being yelled at. And by the way, Jim, those photos, the actual photos, were never released.
Okay.
Wow.
Because I just saw the rail in there, and I thought,
those were locked down, and they were never edited. They weren't allowed to be touched. We had to turn them over, and so they were never finished.
Apologies to Andy.
It got ugly, and I was extremely busy that time because it was a simple shot that the news media, and it was really funny because they would tell you, nobody knew we were going to do this, and we shocked everybody. But if you know anything about AFA, you cannot drop down certain feet without letting the area know. You can't do that without letting the mayor of New York know. You cannot do this without the White House knowing because you got their plane. You cannot do this without AMC knowing. Because
there's a lot of coordination involved.
Yes, and all this stuff was done, but nobody knew how it was done. Now, I felt really bad for the one guy in the Obama administration who got fired for it. I think he was just the guy down the line that got done, but nothing was not covered in that whole mission.
You don't even get another plane next to Air Force One without permission.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So that was a crazy thing, but it even gave you the idea. If you ever try to shoot a jet from a hovering helicopter, you're going to get, and you're going to go, what was that? Even with the high-speed cameras we got today, you couldn't have got that.
No.
But that's where all that went. And believe me, I got cussed out from all kinds of stars telling me about who did I think I was, or my commander, who was a Lieutenant Colonel PA. She got yelled at way more than I did. I just stepped back and was just mad that this was even at that level.
Well, tell me some more stories about getting yelled at. That's probably a good segue into, a little more color on your careers.
Without the backstory, when I was running when first went underneath the communications squadron, I was in England. I had a combat camera unit. We merged with the squadron, and there had been some stuff that had happened earlier in the day that got a lot of senior staff upset. Although I think they were more upset with my boss than they were with what had happened. We had this little vertically challenged major that was in charge of the squadron. He had come out of administration somewhere, and they gave him a whole comm squadron to run. He wasn't doing very well at it, but the blame had to fall on somebody. He called me in his office, kept me at attention in front of his desk, and chewed on me for about 5 minutes, and then threw me out of the office. And I walk out, and there's all these lieutenants, and Skid, you'll know what lieutenants are. They're all standing around with concern on their faces. And I'm trying to stifle a laugh. And they're like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Man, I've had my butt chewed by professionals. This guy doesn't even come close."
I got actually chewed out pretty good because of Fred.
What?
Fred did some training when he was trying to think about, I think he was going to Yahoo or something at that time, when he was looking at getting out. And I just happened to be around when I heard that Ken Wright did Syracuse or whatever, that PJ course, and he didn't sign any paperwork. So I overheard that. And then they said, well, he got the training in punts. So Fred was in the middle of contemplating what he was going to do because he just did some, like, EIC training or something.
Uh-huh.
And we were talking about it. I'm like, well, did you sign anything? He goes, no. You didn't put anything that you were going to do? No. I said, hi, you don't got to give that back. Because I know Ken Wright just did that. And Fred went, yeah, that got back to, was it Major Mac? I think I got in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
I got in trouble for giving that information out. Matter of fact, when he got the job, I made him come back and entertain me for a night in Vandenberg one night. I got chewed out pretty good.
When I separated, it was interesting. Who was the base commander at Vandenberg? Was it Drizmala? Or
Drizmala was over the comm squadron.
Okay.
He would have been there with you.
I remember because I needed to get out early, right? Because I needed to take this job in Silicon Valley, and I needed to get out. What was it? 6 months early or a couple weeks?
It wasn't that much.
It was close. It was close. So I had to write a letter, a why, and explain myself and the impact to my family versus the needs of the area, all this stuff. So I wrote that, and I remember going to his office, and he was, or whoever it was, my memory's foggy on this. Or I remember having this discussion about getting my paperwork signed, my early release paperwork signed. And the conversation basically went like, are you sure you want to do this? Because you're at the halfway point. You could stay in, do your 20 and blah, 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 And then I'm already like, do I really want to do this? But Silicon Valley, I feel like it's going to be a thing. So I end up getting out, and he said, you know what? I think you're making a foolish mistake by separating from the Air Force right now. So we're going to set your separation date as April 1st. It's still up there. April 1st on the wall. That's why my discharge date from the Air Force is officially April Fool's Day because, of reasons.
I don't remember Drizmala being that funny.
Yeah, well, I didn't think it was that funny. Yeah.
I came into the squadron, and Vandenberg came in from Korea, asked to come into Vandenberg by I think the DO then Captain Moore or Major Moore when she was there, she had reached out to me in Korea and said, hey, I really would like to get you here because this is your type of world. And she worked it. And I literally changed my assignment from Wright Pat to Vandenberg. And so when I got to Vandenberg, I walked into Drizmala's office. He welcomed me, and Colonel Drizmala looked at me and went, okay, you'll be in the dorm. I said, oh, excuse me? He goes, you'll be in the dorm. I said, I'm a staff sergeant with divorced, with kids and household. He goes, don't care. You'll be in the dorm. And I went, so I had to go to base housing and to the commander of the base with the plea that they're going to have to pay for my storage because I had furniture that, that was stored. I got kids. I get 6 months out of the year. And when I went back in, he never apologized when they told him, no, you can't do that. He goes, fine, we'll let this happen right now. We'll see if I'm going to let it stay. And I'm like going, I still got kids that are coming 6 months out of the year.
We'll see how long those kids last.
Yeah, it was like he would never give back. He never backed down. It was just like going, wow, I had never met a guy like Drizmala.
I don't know if you remember, Skid, Fred had already left, but the day I got fired, because I was the superintendent.
Oh, I want to hear this.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you'll remember when I tell you. Drizmala fired me because of something to do with a video for the base. They wanted that Guardian Challenge video converted over to the welcome video into the base. The senior enlisted advisor for the base kept asking me for it, and I just kept putting him off because I had a lot on my plate, and it really wasn't my purview. But because somehow I had become the point man and he didn't get it, he complained to Drizmala, and Drizmala fired me. I didn't move from my desk. I didn't have any duties relieved from me. I just lost the title. I still had the job.
I remember that.
And the best part was, literally the day he fired me, we had a banquet that was going on at the club that I had put together a slideshow for. And I was down setting up the equipment in the afternoon before the evening dinner. And Drizmala comes walking in, and he starts pointing at the equipment saying, I think this is this, I think this is this. And he knew what everything was, which really surprised me because, it's kind of high-end equipment. Then he looks over at me and he says, where are you sitting tonight for dinner? And I said, I really don't know. He says, I'd like you to sit at my table. And I'm like, oh, God. And the only time in my life I ever really stood up to the man, I just looked at him and I said, I figured I was ostracized. And only time I ever saw him smile. And he turned around and walked off. And I sat at his table at dinner that night.
Nice. Nice.
I do remember that. And the problem was the enlisted advisor got really ticked off. The videos that he wanted showed airmen drinking alcohol and people drinking alcohol. And we looked at it and refused to give it because that was underneath the Air Force regulations. To me, you cannot show that. The airman that told him, which he protected, I think was Kenyon. But when you told him that he told you that he couldn't do it, he told him no. And he got mad because he was told no. He wanted to. I think we ended up giving the footage, but he couldn't use it. It was not released footage. You couldn't use it because it showed alcohol consumption.
And Drizmala wanted ahead, so he took mine. But it was funny because nothing changed. I had to write myself a letter of reprimand.
I was going to say, I don't remember you leaving or doing anything different.
The best part was McAllister told Chris that he needed to write me a letter of reprimand.
Chris Sonor, our civilian oversight, or some other Chris?
Yeah, Chris Sonor. So since he was busy, I went ahead and wrote my own letter of reprimand and gave it to McAllister to deliver to me. And he's like, man, this is really rough. You can't do this. And I just thought, if I had to write a letter of reprimand to anybody else, that's how I would have written it. So I just wrote on mine. And it went into a drawer somewhere. And nothing changed except that I lost my title.
Well, when you guys talk about these stories about, some of your run-ins with authority, it makes me wonder, on one side, you have this creative art form that requires a certain amount of independent thinking in order to realize the product. And on the other hand, you have the way the military is structured, which doesn't always necessarily support that independent thinking. Do you guys think that was a general tension in the combat camera field throughout your careers? Or do you think these are just sort of isolated incidents that could be anywhere in the military?
When we went underneath COM, the communications squadron, I gave a briefing to the communications commander showing him all of our stats, training, budget, all that stuff. And the last thing I told him was, We take people, we push them, they're artistic, we push them forward, we get them promoted and everything, and suddenly they're in charge. And if they have no logical sense of sort, they're really based out of artistic side of their brain. And you're going to have problems with that. Fortunately, he understood.
Well, I also saw that we got lieutenants like every other week. As we were losing VI officers, a lot of times they didn't get trained as we went to comm officers. So you had these people that had no idea, about the job, and they were put in charge. So that, you were there as you went through it. I think, LT, you were one of the last ones that were VI when you started getting after Malzone, and it was all comm officers. They could fix my computer beautifully. So when my computer didn't work, they would fix it. I'm like, yeah, but they didn't know what the actual job was.
So yeah, I came in as a visual information officer, but you're right. Before I got out of the military, they had merged us in with comm more generically, which included all the telephones and computers. And one of the big reasons I got out was because my next job was probably going to be telephones or something more generic. But I didn't have any special visual information training from the military. There was a focus on being producer directors and an emphasis on developing those skills. And we had civilians, you mentioned Chris Sonor, but other folks who were there full time as producer directors that we learned from with the idea that was the important part of the job.
You were lucky enough to end up in an assignment where you had people that can mentor, because if you just ended up on Joe Bag of Donuts base out in the middle of Wyoming, you would have been in charge.
God help them.
I told a guy one time, a boss that had no idea what audiovisual was all about. He says, I really like what you're doing. Just keep doing it. And I said, and I want you to know, I like what I'm doing, and you'll never hear anything as long as we're doing it right. But let one little thing go wrong, and you will feel the weight of the command section on your shoulders, because they're the ones who it's going to affect.
Looking at this is fascinating. Looking at this from my perspective, which is the airman perspective, kind of the pawn on the chessboard. I was a pawn on the chessboard. You guys are moving around and telling them to do stuff. But, and I got to, take a second to thank Jim, for giving me the latitude to do stuff, right? Because you mentioned the whole, put me in the corner and do Photoshop and that kind of stuff. I'm still doing that stuff to this day, decades later, because that was what I gravitated towards. I think you had the foresight or wherewithal to say, hey, you like doing this stuff and you're pretty good at it, so go over there and make these Guardian Challenge posters.
It really wasn't putting you in a corner. We were really putting you out in the forefront.
In the corner with the Mac, right? Like just making cool stuff. I was a pig in crap, right? So I'm sitting over there learning Photoshop. I remember back then it was Photoshop version 2 or something, like pre-layers. And I remember just trying to figure stuff out. How do you do this? And I still have some of that work. And looking back on it, by today's standards, it was crap. But back then it was magic, right? And then we got that big poster printer and we're printing stuff out. It was crazy.
Back in those days when LT was running teams, his biggest asset for most of the other lieutenants was his coordination. Because when he would coordinate a team, either being the lead camera or whatever, you didn't think about that. He would organize everything all the way out.
Yeah, detailed.
Some of the lieutenants would not do that. And so you were like going, how are we getting from the airport? I didn't really think about that. You're landing and you have rental cars and everything set up. So coordination-wise was awesome.
Yeah.
He, the lieutenant, is me, you mean? You guys are talking about me? I'm sitting right here. But
you, the lieutenant.
We always talk about you third person.
I had lieutenants at Vandenberg after you that literally I was doing IG videos. And he would be upset because the IG would come into the gym where we were editing. And the 06 would walk up and talk to me, the staff sergeant. And he come up, running up to me, the butter bar lieutenant, going, why do you want to talk to me? I'm like, because you're with the kid. I'm over here working. What does that mean? Never mind. I have to get this done.
I remember walking out on the floor of the hangar one day where they kept all the tracking mounts out of the weather, tracking cameras. Skid had about literally 15 or 18 young enlisted guys standing around and a whole bunch of flat, empty pallets. You load the equipment on them and then push them up on the aircraft. And he was trying to figure out if we did a loadout, how the stuff was all going to fit on the pallets. And of course, he had his computer out with his spreadsheet. I suspect he still lives in spreadsheets. And but he would point at a piece of equipment that's in the shipping crates, and then point at one of the airmen and say, put that over there. Then he would go back to his spreadsheet, and then he would find another piece of equipment and say, go carry that over there and put it on that pallet. And I'm watching this because, he's a new lieutenant. He doesn't understand the relationship of NCOs and airmen and all that yet. And so I walk over. I said, you want to make this happen? Stand aside. Sergeant Stayton will fix this. Y'all get busy. All of a sudden, everybody was moving boxes.
Jim, two things. First of all, you told that story last time, and so I'm not sure it's going to survive the edit process of this one. Two, I question your timing. JR just said something nice about working with me, and then you got to just come and undercut it. Like that's, that does not get you favorite guest status here.
I would just add, well, he really learned from it.
My best story about LT was in Montana. We were doing a missile silo. We were up there. Matter of fact, I even got credit for doing sorts because we did a training video on how to do sorts. And somehow he got us even credit for it. Actually, I think it was TO, how to update the technical order, which I was multimedia. We didn't have any TOs, by the way, which was a pain the rest of my career because they kept saying, well, you're qualified for that. And I'm like, well, how did I get qualified for that? I remember we did a video on it. But it was really funny because working with LT, knowing that he was from Yale, so obviously you have to tease him. And he knows I'm extremely right, a conservative, and he wasn't. And we were discussing it one night, and I'll never forget, we were in the middle of a Montana bar, and he was telling me, he goes, no, I know where you're at. I'm like going, yeah, you have no clue. I'm a Texan. I'm as bad as it gets. He goes, I get that. And he goes, we're solving problems. We're drinking beer. And like we told each other the next day, if we could remember what we discussed, we could have set the world right that night. But one of the things we were talking about was men marrying men. And we were going back and forth about that. And he was trying to make a point. And it was so funny because he goes, all right, look, wait a minute. Just look. Me and you're married and we want kids. And he yells this out, and I'm looking around in Montana at this bar going, we're going to die before
Wow.
I said to her, I was like, oh my God, this is over. The LT has killed me. This is going to be on my tombstone.
We survived.
Remember, that was in 95? That was kind of a crazy time, but it was like, oh, we're going to die. But it was funny because, like I said, the next day we were very competitive about if we could have remembered what we were drinking and discussing to solve the world's problems.
We were ahead of our time.
Yeah.
And Jim, speaking of LT's disregard for the chain of command, just to round off the discussion, I distinctly remember back when we were doing all this Photoshop stuff and, all these different exercise requirements. LT, I don't know if you remember this, but you used to beeline to me directly all the time for, hey, Aaron Johnson, can you just do this real quick? Can you? And I'm like, you need to fill out a work order, or this needs to go through so-and-so because I've got all this stuff ahead of you. No, could you just knock it out real quick? Just get this done.
No, I do not remember that.
I do. All right, I'll do it real quick, So I became like the secret weapon for Skid, right? Yeah, that was good. I remember those. Those are good times. I was curious what you guys think of the name change of Vandenberg. It is now Vandenberg Space Force Base. It is no longer Vandenberg Air Force Base.
Yeah, they did change.
It's changed. It's gone.
It was always a spacey base for me.
It was. It was a space base.
A lot of people who listen to this as a combat camera podcast may not understand, if they haven't been around the military, that our jobs were not always in the combat camera career field. Sometimes we worked for other commands, had other missions. I was at U.S. Space Command back in the mid-'80s when it oversaw NORAD and Air Force Space Command and the Space Warfare Center, lots of those space-based things. It was run by an Air Force general. I can still remember the things that he wanted to happen in space are really things that have only over the last 5 or 6 years are actually coming to fruition now. launch on demand and things to replace broken satellites, space-based radar.
They were talking making Space Command its own Air Force way back when we were at Vandenberg.
Was it like to be a militarized version of NASA? That was kind of the idea.
Pretty much is what I see happening, because you got to understand there was a lot of things that was happening at even Vandenberg, because we had our classified sites. They would do launch and we didn't do any video. We were like going, I wonder what that was. And it was those things that didn't happen that happened. You're like going, cool. And we were part of one of the biggest things that happened during our time was the Iridium, if you remember, and that was putting in all the cell relays up there. And we launched a lot of those, which is where we're at today about GPS and everything else.
You remember those used to explode? I remember I was on one of those helicopters. It was me and I forget who. It was probably Albert, right?
Burlock.
Sitting next to me on one of those UH-1s, orbiting one of the space launch complexes, and they lit off one of those, I think it was a Titan that went up and exploded and set half of the base on fire.
It was either me or Gerloff. We're the ones that did that little Tyler mount on the mount of that helo to shoot that.
That was a little scary because I remember sitting in that aircraft orbiting, and this thing launches and it starts going off a couple of degrees in the wrong direction. They light it off, and I remember this ball. It was like the world's biggest Roman candle, right? This thing explodes, and I remember feeling the heat of the explosion in the aircraft, right? 3 miles away. You could feel it was just. And then when you're in an aircraft and you got pilots saying, "Oh shit," and banking, away, and you're like, I remember the thoughts that were going through my mind was, okay, I'm completely helpless. There's nothing I can do about this, and I'm in a tin can full of jet fuel, and there's a ball of flame over there. So yeah, that was, memories.
You understand that?
When I was at U.S. Space Command, there was a mindset, not Air Force Space Command, but U.S. Space Command, because under the umbrella with NORAD and the Space Warfare Center and things, I mean, you're rubbing shoulders with astronauts every day, people who have already been to space. When there's launches coming up and things, there's a lot of focus, which you wouldn't have around the regular Air Force. And then being up around the mountain when there was going to be a launch from, at the time, the Soviet Union or China, or I think North Korea had one missile that they were playing with at the time. But it was great to be the guy behind the camera, getting to experience it, watch it through other people. Of course, we're not hands-on ourselves, but we're there to document it so that it can be either put into historical archives or used for sharing with the public what's going on.
Jim, I thought that was going to dovetail in some story about how you broke NORAD.
I didn't break NORAD. What I did was we had a problem. The OSI came to me and they said that they had a problem with contractor malfeasance. There were two communication modules, one located somewhere outside of the continental United States and one that was located at the Space Warfare Center in Colorado. And it was basically a radar site communicating what it saw to NORAD and the Space Warfare Center and things. But these were the only two units. They were supposedly identical. And I was told that I could not take electronic flash into the room where the communication system was because of the electromagnetic pulse off the flash would damage the equipment. So rather, the room had a copper shield on it to protect it from outside electrical interference. So I took just a hot light with me, 150 watt bulb with a little aluminum reflector on it. And we pulled one of the circuit boards out, laid it on the table, and I could see where there was spare solder and things that had spread out on the board. And that was what they wanted photographed. And I reached over and turned on the hot light, and the system in the room went down. I had busted the EMP just with that light. So that has to be reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon. Because now a major radar system in the United States has lost contact with Cheyenne Mountain, and other than by telephone, can't report what's going on. So they were passing my name around at the JCS that night. Oh, just by the way, contractor had the pictures handed to him at the trial and capitulated when the pictures were handed to him. They had to refund the government a whole bunch of money. So yay for us.
I was on a trip to NORAD when we got to see these, we went to this room with these Cray supercomputers. Do you remember that?
They were out at the Warfare Center. Those weren't at the mountain.
Yeah, it was off-site. Yeah, we went to the mountain too, but it was off-site.
They just sat there in a room, empty.
Yeah, liquid cooled. It was Star Trek. Yeah.
They weren't hooked up. They were just sitting there. And they were brought there because the military manned orbiting system that was supposed to go before Challenger blew up.
Mm-hmm.
They were going to start launching out of Vandenberg. They were launching the shuttle. And this was the computers that were going to be used to work with the shuttle.
Mm.
Basically a replica of what they have down in Houston. Part of that system was 2 Cray supercomputers. They're beautiful to look at, but that's all they ever did was they sat in this room because they canceled the shuttle.
And I wonder what the power of those things are compared to like the latest phones today.
That's so crazy. Well, I will tell you, Jim, that combat camera changed a bit from when you were in just being photographer. After 9/11, we had to make some adjustments because you got to remember we had decades after Vietnam of just like I like to refer to it, exercises. And you could get up and walk into the middle of a field at Vandenberg to get that reverse angle. The only time that it ever felt like you were even scary is if you wore miles gear and a beep went off. But when you actually got out into the combat zone that we went in after 9/11, we had to make some adjustments. Every prisoner that went to Guantanamo Bay was pretty much escorted by us. We had to document their process of transportation and all the way through. We had to document all of the stuff that we were doing. We were with Special Forces. And even at the end, my career broke through with the SEALs, where we would go in on these raids and be third or fourth man in. You carried an M4 on one side, 9mm on your chest, and a camera on the left side, depending on which hands you were. And we had to practice transition with different specialized organizations that taught us how to work both between the weapon and the camera system. Because the point was, if we came out of that with no imagery, why were we there? They always looked at us as a risk. We were a risk going into this operation because we were unfamiliar. So if they put us into that, we had to have a reason.
It was certainly our intent when I was in that we were trained to provide audiovisual in a threat environment. But to your point, JR, those were not the years where things were going on. And so there's a lot more story there to tell.
I could go on, like I said, my privilege was to retire, as the chief of combat camera, because to sit in there and run that and look at it, get the flying slots back up to 9D to do the operations and just continue to do what we had to do in the fights that we had to do it with.
And JR, when did you actually retire? Don't make me do the math.
2011.
JR, you should come back. Let's plan that for next year. I want to hear more about how combat camera changed over the years.
Hey, I didn't even get to the best story ever, was you riding a horse. McAllister set us up where we could go ride because they had to move the horses lower because we were at Estes Park, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And we were riding through and, I'm wearing a cowboy hat hanging out with the Wrangler in the back. And he looks at it and goes, how good of riders do you think these people are? I had John Noon on a horse. I had LT on a horse. I'm like, well, they're in the saddle. He goes, why don't we race beside each side of them and the horses they're on will follow? Do you think they'll fall off? I go, I have no clue. So we did. And as the horses took off, and all I could hear when the horse was running by was, at ease, at ease. I was dying. I was like going, I never knew a military horse understood at ease. And John Noon looked like someone shot him because he was from the city and had never rode a horse like that. It took off.
JR and I had to go into Estes Park. We were shooting a daily videos for a conference, singles conference up at Estes Park. It was a tough one.
You told this story last time. I know where this one's going.
JR and I were down in town shooting. He was getting video. I was getting stills. And on the way back, there was a brewery. And I said, pull in there. And JR says, we got to get back. I said, pull in there. I'm buying you a beer, man. So we pull into the brewery and we asked, what kind of beer you got? And the guy gave us each 7 shots on the little wooden thing. He said, here, try them. So we're like, we're in a hurry, man. Doop, 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 doop. Right down. And then we got the souvenir Estes Park Brewery pint glass of our favorite beer. And And we had to drink that down really fast, and we had to hustle back because LT needed the video, and we needed to eat before they closed the dining facility. We put the glasses in your camera bag.
Yeah.
And we went off to eat, and LT was looking for another tape, seeing if there's another tape, and he opened it up, and there's these 2 wet pint glasses of beer sitting in the camera case.
I remember on that because Jim was very nice and told us, he goes, look, guys, we're out here, we're in civvies, you don't have to shave. So I thought that was really awesome. So we weren't shaving for a couple of days, and I went by him, and he's clean shaven. I'm like, Jim, you said we weren't shaving. He goes, if I don't shave, I'll lose my face in the fur. So I went, okay.
In the fur.
He goes, I got to maintain it.
That was a fun trip, though.
Yeah, it was.
I did it 5 times.
You went 5 times to Estes Park?
Yeah, I got Captain Erskine. Did you know him?
Very well.
I remember
Oh,
Ursula.
yeah, I remember.
Captain Erskine was very creative. He was a true VI officer. When he came, not saying that you were, but he had all these creative ideas. And we climbed up, it was so funny, to 13,000 feet and sat in a field for like hours trying to get animals because he wanted animals for the opening. And then we were moving around, and there's 2 elk fighting in the middle. So I grabbed my 50-pound Betacam and slide down this hill. And I don't know if you've ever been at 13,000 feet, but when I got down there, I'm videotaping these 2 elk fighting. It was like an awesome video. And they're up there, come on up after the elk ran off. Well, it took me 30, 40 seconds to get down. It took me almost an hour to get back up. I'm laying on my camera. I swear I was dying. And that animals that we got were all back at Estes Park because they weren't up there. They were hanging out there eating at the trash can at the brewery. They were eating. Every live animal he wanted to get was at Estes Park. He didn't have to go anywhere.
Yeah, I went up there and saw you that year after I retired. I still got the pictures because they built the van.
Yeah, that's what we had, TV van.
And rather than having to haul all the equipment, they just made someone drive it up.
Yeah, it was Terry Fail's van. Every time he was in there, I had to put in my profanity sound buttons in because I wouldn't know what a camera mover was if I didn't have profanity in front of it. That was that made it go. Oh,
Guys, it was a lot of fun going back. It's always good catching up with you guys.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
XLT.
hey, thanks, LT.
Season 9 continues, and thanks for sticking with us. If you're new to the podcast, I hope you'll check out some other episodes. It's easy to peruse the entire catalog at the website, belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. All episodes of the podcast are also now on IMDb, so you can cross-reference the film credits of my guests. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and rate us if you like what you hear. If you've got questions or comments, you can send email to skid, S-K-I-D, at belowtheline.biz. If you're on Facebook, you can find photos and other behind-the-scenes materials at Podcast Below the Line. And finally, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Pod Below the Line. I also want to plug Fred Johnson's website, thisweekinphoto.com. It's been running continuously for the last 10 years, and as advertised, it's about all things photo. Thanks to Curtis Five for our music and John Wan for our logo. The logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Loyal listeners, you are much appreciated. If you're enjoying this season, tell your friends. We'll be back again next week.